So I would sometimes let in the moths and they would crash around in the lampshades and I'd be scared of them and I'd stand on the bed and scream and then I'd throw books at them when they were against the wall. And I remember thinking, genuinely thinking, we don't need insects. What's the point of them? We could do without them. Little did I know.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World with me, Ben Goldsmith, and I'm incredibly excited to be here with my friend and hero, Stephen Fry.
You are too kind, Ben.
Stephen, normally these episodes are about highlighting individual projects. I've interviewed some people from different parts of the world who are putting together landscape rewilding projects or putting back species or saving species. And this is kind of a sort of departure because you're the first kind of close friend of mine to join and the first person who's involved in a whole panoply of different projects. The first time I really thought of you as a big kind of nature lover and supporter was when I saw that you were president of the Great Fen, the Wicken Fen Restoration Project in East Anglia. How did that come about?
Well, I come from East Anglia. I was raised in Norfolk and universitied at Cambridge, so the whole area between Cambridge and the Fens means a lot to me. It's not everybody's cup of tea. Noel Coward has destroyed it forever. When you say you come from Norfolk, people quote him from Private Lives, very flat Norfolk. And we always say it's pathetic. It's like people who live in Richmond or something, and you say to them, oh, God, I've got to go all the way out there. They go, oh, it takes me 15 minutes to get into the West End. Lies. Absolute lies. And Norfolk people say, actually, Norfolk's quite hilly. It's Cambridgeshire and Huntingdonshire that are flat. Well, Norfolk is quite flat, but it's beautiful. And I grew up deep in the country, and I'm old enough to remember hedgerows as they were. Fortunately, they're coming back. But there was a time in the early 70s, late 60s, when I was a boy, when they were suddenly got rid of. And I remember my mother, she now regrets it, saying, well, I'm quite pleased because it's so much safer to drive in the lanes now. You can see cars coming from... and she had a point, because with the thick lanes, you never knew. You had to hoot at every bend. But Norfolk then was pure countryside. And there are things I regret. I hated insects, particularly moths and June bugs, as we called them, these big things that flew in through the window at night. And because I was addicted to reading at night and it would be hot, I had to decide, if I open the window, in will come the moths. And if I close the window, I will suffer from overheating. So I would sometimes let in the moths and they would crash around in the lampshades and I'd be scared of them and I'd stand on the bed and scream and then I'd throw books at them when they were against the wall. And I remember thinking, genuinely thinking, we don't need insects. What's the point of them? You know, wasps, beetles, we could do without them. Little did I know. It took me a long time to learn. Eventually, when I sort of started to fall in love with natural history, Darwinism and all those sort of things, a lot through the influence of my friend Douglas Adams, the writer of Hitchhiker. He was obsessed with species depredation and things. Anyway, I sort of looked back then when I got to my 30s and 40s, and I remembered corncrakes and skylarks and some of the birds that began to disappear from the Norfolk landscape, simply because of the hedgerow depredation and various other things, organophosphates and the terrible kinds of chemicals that were being used. And I became more aware, and I got to know people on the North Norfolk coast who were doing work for birds and so on, and understood that actually insects were rather important.
So, but Norfolk and East Anglia are sort of a tale of two landscapes, because on the one hand, you've got some of the most agriculturally productive soil in the whole of Britain. I think I read in Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy report that 85% of the food that we produce in this country comes from just 20% of the land, and nearly all of that is in the east of Britain, and a lot of it's centred around where you grew up. But at the same time, you've also got some of the last real wildernesses in Britain, in the vestiges of the great wetlands that were found down the east coast. So it's a funny dichotomy in a way. And there's a strange struggle emerging now between those that want every square inch to be farmed and those that think, well, actually, some of these wetlands serve a different purpose and we ought to have them back.
Yes, absolutely right. I can remember my brother and I used to get invited to, young farmer barn dances. Dreadful events, as you can imagine. But and the snobbery there was a fantastic inverted snobbery. If you had a smart car, you were nobody. But if you had a terrible old thing that was held together with baler twine, then you were a god. And they had, my brother and I used to laugh because if ever you gave the slightest critical remark about farming, about the huge sort of syndication of farmland, the slow turning of it into a kind of Iowan plains without stands of wood and coppices and spinneys and so on, they would always say the same thing. You want to eat, don't you? And that was it. That was the end of argument. And yes, there's a genuine sympathy one can have for farmers. They are providing food for the nation. And we used to tease them that all the wheat that was grown in Norfolk went for biscuits and that proper wheat was grown in Canada and Russia.
But I think this food security argument, I think, is it's overused because in that same report by Henry Dimbleby points out that the least productive 20% of our country produces less than 2% of the food. So the idea that we can't consider nature also to be critical infrastructure with its place, for example, in our national parks, I think is an absurdity. And we needn't choose, of course, because there's lots of places where highly productive farming goes on, surrounded by nature and corn crakes and all those kind of things, in among the fields where the food is grown. But I think that what's fascinating about Norfolk and the Wicken Fen project and so on is the change that the East Anglia's undergone over the last 1,000, 500, 100 and even 50 years. Now, there was a whole culture. The Fenlanders would have lived a life that was sort of almost hunter-gatherer, gathering enormous amounts of waterfowl for sending down to London for those huge feasts and enormous volumes of eels and salmon and other migratory fish. And they probably would have lived a life much closer to hunting and gathering than farming. So when we think of the Fens as being a place where, growing carrots runs in the blood and has done forever, it's not actually really accurate, is it, in a sense?
No, that's a very good point indeed. And the variety and diversity of the Wicken Fen is an absolute eye-opener as to what that land can be like, because we're so, as you say, trained into thinking of the fen tigers with their potatoes and carrots and all the rest of it, and nothing else, just black alluvial soil stretching as far as the eye can see. But actually, it's a place now that with the hen harriers and these extraordinary sedge warblers and amazing species of bird that you can go and see. The marvellous Miriam Rothschild had her own little lodge there where she would, look at not just those wonderful birds, but the tiniest little wildflowers that grew there as well. And that's what we need to see coexisting with farmland. And I think the good thing is farmers do appreciate that now, and that they see the value of the set-aside and the various other strategies to increase the diversity of wildlife around them, and they don't see it necessarily as being either make a profit, a full profit, or encourage biodiversity. The two are compatible and give them more pleasure. Farmers, are human beings. They like to see a beautiful countryside too. And also the shooting. In Norfolk, of course, there's a lot of shooting. And I used to, although I don't do it myself, I'm a complete wuss, I sort of defended it because that's the only reason there were any woodlands in Norfolk at all, was for raising the birds. But at the same time, I would be upset because there would be a lot of shooting of birds of prey.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. I love that you mentioned Miriam Rothschild. I married her great niece, Kate, with whom I remained very close. I think you were at the wedding. And I used to go and visit her, and she was in her late 90s and I was in my early 20s. And she said, you must keep coming because you remind me not of your father, but of your grandfather, Frank. And she had this, not a romance, but a great crush on my grandfather who was older than her. She remembered walking arm in arm with him down the promenade at Cannes in 1919, the end of the First World War, where he was putting back together his Carlton Hotel. And I used to go and sit by her bedside. And I think one of the last times she was able to leave her house, age 98 or 99, we went in a vehicle and looked at the Roughs, which was an area of land she'd given over to the American Air Force in the Second World War to create an airfield. And it had been inadvertently rewilded since the end of the Second World War. And you had these wonderful, gnarly, stunted willows and oaks growing in this kind of semi-open ground that was just heaving with little reptiles, little lizards and grass snakes and adders and butterflies. And it was a paradise. But it was sort of the first rewilding project I came across because you could just make out the vestiges of this Second World War airfield on her Roughs.
Oh, that's brilliant. And a proof of the great phrase of Horace, the Latin poet, I can't quite, it's something like tamen focus recessit naturae resurgit something. But it basically means no matter how much you push it back with a pitchfork, nature will come roaring back.
I know. And if you go to the tropics, I spent 2 weeks in Mumbai for one of my daughters had a medical treatment there. I had 2 weeks there. And there are these extraordinary Art Deco buildings that haven't been looked after. And you have these enormous fig trees growing out of the second floor. And, nature reclaims incredibly quickly. But on this subject of wetlands, we're in a better position, I think, for nature recovery on the other side of the country here in Somerset. Somerset, the summer settlement. I'm on the edge of what's known as the Vale of Avalon or the Somerset Levels. And that's a landscape which is not agriculturally productive, unlike the Fens and East Anglia. It's a landscape that's very hard to farm. And so you only need to tweak the incentives very slightly in favour of carbon sequestration, flood mitigation.
I was going to say the flood mitigation has to be sensitively done so that it is human friendly, but it doesn't do to the levels what the Duke of Bedford did to the Fens.
Stephen, did you as a child spend enormous amounts of time in nature? I mean, I remember as a child looking for frogs and toads and putting up boxes, and it was sort of my special interest, the thing I cared about most from a very early age. Were you the same?
A bit. I mean, I loved Gerald Durrell, and I used to think, I wish I lived in a place like Corfu so I sort of overlooked Norfolk as a young boy, but I went to prep school in Gloucestershire, 200 miles away. That was amazing. That was sort of just off the Slad Valley. In fact, we had Laurie Lee used to come and visit the school and give us talks and read from Cider with Rosie and things like that. And the headmaster had 4 daughters, so it was a really friendly, it wasn't one of those sadistic, horrible prep schools. It was these 4 girls sort of ran it, and they were mad about horses and nature, and there was a big lake and we would all fish, and riding was not even an extra, you all had to do it, and there were these big woods, and we would go and look at the woods, and we were taught wildflowers. I remember Herb Robert and Campion and all these different things, and the smell of wild garlic around the lake and the mallows, and I did get very, very interested, and I would do something that sounds so fey, but was a very popular Victorian and Edwardian pastime amongst men and women, and that is I'd press wildflowers, find wildflowers, and I suppose it was wicked to pick them, but we never thought they were rare in those days. And, if I think, I haven't got that one, and I would take it.
I certainly noticed as a child that if I was deprived of spending time in nature, and if I was cooped up indoors for whatever reason, or I definitely felt that my attention would turn to being outside, and I would start to feel a sense of needing it or yearning for it. And I wouldn't have used anything like that language back then, but somewhere deep down I knew, and I longed to get back from holidays sometimes, because I had all kinds of projects in this large garden I grew up in Richmond that you know very well. I used to spend time digging out ponds and putting up bird boxes and things that were projects, and I wanted to know what was happening with them. So I wanted to get home from holiday. And when I grew older, I found at the most difficult times in my life that being outside in nature in almost whatever form has been the most powerful tonic. Whether it's a warm cup of tea in my hands and the sun coming up early in the morning, and the bird song, or swimming in a very large pond at the bottom of my garden here in Somerset, sometimes 6-8 times a day during difficult times in my life. And I felt held at certain moments by this love of nature that I have.
Well, you've written about this quite beautifully and very touchingly, and made me feel envious, not of your splendid spread of land. I mean, we can all be envious of that, but that's really not the point, as you also make in your book. It's your, the fact that you do that. And I'm sort of guilty because, if I want to put it in a grand way, the Romans had a phrase, rus et urbs, just means country and city. Rus as in rustic and urbs as in urban, obviously. And they sort of noticed the difference because they were the first, literally, civilization in terms of CIV. The civis is a Roman thing. Civis is the city, and they kind of noticed that they had become something else by being city dwellers. They did change them. So the great poets, Virgil and Horace in particular, who were pretty much contemporaries, wrote about the countryside, the Georgics and the eclogues in the case of Virgil, and Horace, all kinds of odes about it, in which they meditated. And I remember reading that and thinking, yes, there is a part of me, and I think a lot of humans, that needs a pavement beneath my feet and people around me, even if I don't know them, just the buzz of humanity. I need it. It's part of not feeling alone. It's part of being the tribe that we are, the tribes and clans and groups that we sort ourselves out into. But another part of me yearns for the countryside to stand alone, as you say, with a cup of tea, looking at a field or the sky or hills or whatever it might be. And the extraordinary thing about the human brain, because we can almost overdo, in a sense, the need for the countryside as if any lack of it will make us unwell. And that is that you can stand in a field. I've done it in Norfolk where you're completely alone. And there might be a stand of trees somewhere on the horizon. And if a leaf is turned over by the wind and you see the silvery other side, your head turns to it and you're 100 yards away from it. But your senses are so attuned. Because, we evolved either to look for lunch or to run away from being lunch. But then, 2 hours later, after a train journey, you're standing in Oxford Street on the phone, talking to someone, while 1,000 voices are talking around you, and you're skipping traffic and avoiding people on the pavement, and your brain can cope with that too. So we mustn't underestimate the power of our brain to live in a city as well as to live in the country.
I mean, the author E.O. Wilson coined the term biophilia to describe the innate love that all humans have for the non-human world.
Yes, he was the great expert on colonization and socialization, wasn't he?
Exactly. And he describes the love we feel for our dog as being, integral to our lives and ubiquitous. All people feel this sense of love for the non-human. That's why we pay twice for an apartment which overlooks the park versus one that doesn't, or for a hotel room on holiday that can see the ocean versus one that doesn't.
Yes.
And another writer I like is Richard Louv, who coined the term nature deficit disorder. And he wrote a book called Last Child in the Woods and described how incredibly important it is developmentally and emotionally, particularly for children, to spend a certain amount of time in contact with the natural world. And he says it's akin to meditation in the sense that all 5 of your senses are occupied at the same time, thereby somehow opening a sort of sixth sense, some different sense, which brings us a sense of well-being. And I don't think it needs to be just available to those who live in the countryside or who are privileged in one way or another. I set up with Sadiq Khan in 2021 the Rewilding London Task Force, and we've already spent several £1 million on rewilding projects within London. If you go walking in Regent's Park or Primrose Hill or
which I do,
any of them,
yes.
You'll see little pockets of scrub with fenced exclosures and wilder reed beds along the watercourses, and all of the green spaces in London now have a target of about a third unmanaged or less managed. And there are 7 NEP-style rewilding projects now around the periphery of London. Enfield, Hainault Forest, the Dagenham Marshes, and so one in Croydon. And these are big, with natural processes, native cattle, beavers at Ealing, beavers at Enfield.
Yes, the beavers is so exciting, aren't they? Just fantastic.
And of course, we did our beaver dinner in 2022 and raised a lot of money for the Beaver Trust.
And it was one of the interesting things because it's still a fight to persuade, owners of grouse moors and shoots not to do terrible things to the red kites and the other raptor birds, because it's so easy to forget the necessity of having a class of raptors. It's horrible when you see a falcon tearing apart a nest or something, and you think, oh, you beasts. But one of the most remarkable things, which I'm sure you're aware of, is what they discovered in Yellowstone when they reintroduced wolves, that it increased the population of beavers. It was no one expected it. It was the oddest thing. Wolves were coming in. Local farmers were furious. Some of them were trying to shoot the wolves. I remember going to Wyoming and hearing this unbelievable sound of wolves howling at night. It's just the most chillingly, thrillingly fantastic noise you've ever heard. And wondering about this, what they were doing. And then they were surviving on elk, amongst other things. And this altered the elk's patterns of migration and movement during the winter. There were fewer of them, and they went in different places to avoid the wolves. And so they weren't destroying the shoots, the young shoots of trees that they had been regularly eating and eating and eating. And this created more of exactly the right wood and saplings and things that the beavers used for their dams.
And more berries, and therefore more bears.
And more bears, yeah.
And the most interesting of all, in a way, was that then the return of beavers and the new vegetation along the river brought stability to the rivers themselves, which meant more salmon.
Exactly. It's a cascade of fantastic outcomes.
Exactly. And I think that we're told, in the case of wolves, we're told, well, farmers hate wolves. And you'd understand, your first instinct would be to understand why, because they might take livestock, and they do take livestock. But not all farmers hate wolves, in the sense that in Europe, anyone growing crops, anyone growing vines or vegetables, anyone with pigs is absolutely delighted by the return of wolves. Foresters are delighted by the return of wolves, because the only places in Europe where deer and wild boar, which do huge crop damage, are under control and managed is where there are wolves. And even some livestock farmers now are starting to come round to wolves on the basis that coexistence has been shown to be possible. There are electric fencing, guard dogs, guard donkeys, all llamas, all kinds of things are being tried, and it's working in a number of different places, and it's generously supported. Places like Belgium are really highly effective now at coexisting with livestock and wolves. The issue of wolves is sort of totemic for rewilding as a movement, because it's so easy for it to be dragged into a kind of culture war discussion. That wolves, people who want wolves are anti-farmers, anti-food and all that, sort of misanthropic in a way. And I think it's the exact opposite. We need to live in vibrant ecosystems that have equilibrium and where all the important component parts are there.
Yeah, I so agree. And my house in Norfolk, I do have a house in Norfolk still, and it's my only, as it were, place in the country. It's not a huge garden, but I did this year, I asked the fellow who looks after the garden for me, look, I said, I've been watching Monty Don, I've been listening to Chris Packham, and I've come to the conclusion, along with them, that these lawns are not a good thing. And anyway, you've been fighting molehills for the last, 20 years with no success. They just come back and back, drive us all crazy, and they stop us from having, croquet or something ridiculous. So let's give them over to wildflowers. Let's dig them up, rotivate, just do that. And he was kind of, really? I said, well, you go and look it up and see how it works, and I'll do it, and we'll get seeds. And it has been fantastic. People who come and look at it go, oh my God, it's so beautiful, so happy-making. And then to watch the insects buzzing around. It's a tiny little pocket handkerchief in the middle of sort of Westish Norfolk. And it's, the idea that it's going to save the world is ridiculous. But
I don't think it is.
I don't think it is. No, it makes me happy, and it does its bit.
Yeah, I don't think the idea that kind of thing will save the world is ridiculous at all. This idea of think global and act local. I think we need to weave nature back into our lives. I think if someone lives on the 34th floor of a tower block in Roehampton and they decide to put native wildflowers in a window box in order to attract in butterflies and so on, I think that is absolutely central to the whole idea. And I don't know if you sense it as well. You're someone who's cared about nature and cared about these issues for decades, somewhat ahead of your time. I feel a culture shift taking place in the world around our relationship with nature. I think if you'd told us 10 years ago that we'd be having this conversation now about beavers back in Kent and Dorset and wolves in Yellowstone and 100 million people watching a video about it on YouTube, I think we'd have thought you were mad. And I think something big is happening.
You're absolutely right. I'm an ambassador and have been for decades, actually, for Fauna and Flora International, which is a terrific charity. It works with others like the Durrell and various things. But it's one of the most crucial things is with people, all people who live around and they're living from the land or the sea in which these habitats, these threatened habitats are. And it's fantastic when you see that actually it does help. And the problem partly has been in Britain because of the fragile and sensitive nature of what I believe is called the discourse, is that it can seem very top-down. It so happens literally top-down because the king is one of the first people to have done this, to have had wildflower gardens, to have talked about these kinds of move towards rewilding and to have led by example with his own land and so on. And it can seem like a kind of grand or almost virtual signalling hobby that people have, which others feel they don't have time for or the land for, or that it's for other people. And I think that's what's changing, thank goodness, is that it is now part of a more general conversation, not the elite, as people insist on saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've hit the nail absolutely on the head. I think nature has been considered some kind of luxury for the privileged. And I think the conversation of recent years has flipped that on its head, and it's now considered more of a birthright. Now, it's a question of social equity. Now, why should a child growing up in Tower Hamlets not have the right to look up and see a peregrine falcon above his or her head on their way to school, or to see flocks of migrating birds in the autumn flying overhead, the wildflowers in the ground beneath their feet? This idea that nature is a birthright and that we all must have access to nature for physical health, mental health, emotional well-being, and a sense of spiritual connection. I mean, I know you don't use that kind of language, but I wonder if you do.
No, it's fair, yeah.
Is nature perhaps a place where you come closest to finding what others might describe to be spiritual connection or even God?
Absolutely. I mean, I shiver a bit at what I think is woo-woo, and especially when it tries to adduce fake science and things like that. I mean, if it's, I'm a great lover of the ideas behind animism, which is the world's biggest religion, really, all over the world, the third world or developing world. That there are people who see spirits in trees and in rivers and so on. And the ancient Greeks, whom I love and reverence, called them nymphs. But there's, we could call them fairies, sprites, peris, whatever. There are all kinds of words from our culture and from all the cultures of the world that imbue nature with a kind of spirit. And that's what the word spiritual comes from. So I'm very open to that. And I love thinking that like His Majesty, I talk to trees and flowers, hello, you're a bit yellow, and whatever it might be, because it's a totally natural thing to do, because you are one living entity communing with another living entity. It may be a different sort of living entity.
Or two twigs of the same tree, perhaps.
Yes, absolutely.
But the king got on the stage at an Asian elephant conservation dinner I was at last year, and he said very simply that the knowledge of the world's remaining First Nations people, or the world's remaining animists, I suppose he meant, represents humanity's best last hope. In the sense that the 80% of the world's remaining intact ecosystems are in places where those with animist religious tendencies are in charge, the Amazon basin. So
it's a knowledge seed bank, as it were.
Exactly. And maybe to save nature, we do need to re-enchant it.
Yes. Yes, I think that's beautiful. I'm completely happy with that language and with those thoughts. I think you would have to be coldly and almost pathologically disconnected from your own self if you were totally disconnected from nature in feeling, in having a connection.
Yeah.
Even if you are brought up in the city, the experience And some people, it's only when they go to a music festival that they actually, the first time they've been in a country lane or walked, through fields and things. But if they didn't respond, it would be a sign of some terrible dysfunction, I think. And in a wider sense, that is perhaps what we've been suffering from.
It's such an interesting idea of the music festival. It's true. So many young people have their first connection with nature at these festivals. I completely agree with you. That's an opportunity.
Yeah.
I've become friendly with the team that operate Glastonbury, which is the biggest and the most iconic of all the festivals. And I long for Glastonbury Festival to become a centre of knowledge dissemination around the rewilding of the Somerset Levels. It sits there on its hillside looking out over Glastonbury Tor, looking out towards the Great Levels, which have been desecrated. And I love the idea of however many 200,000-300,000 people calling for the restoration of the Somerset, of Avalon at every Glastonbury festival. Stephen, which of all the projects overseas that you've been associated with through Fauna and Flora or any other organisation fills you with the most sense of joy and excitement?
Well, I would have said that it was translocating the last male white northern rhinoceros in the world from a zoo in Prague, of all places. You may know the Conservancy Olpejeta in Kenya. Very well known and extraordinary place, quite a large footprint of land in which rare and threatened species are looked after on this conservancy. And the northern white rhino is a subspecies of rhinoceros that is now sort of functionally extinct. There was this one male whose name was Sudan because he'd been collected by a zookeeper in the, 60s, 70s, whenever it was, in the country of Sudan. And he ended up in this zoo next to a female in Prague, but they didn't mate. It's one of the most important things you have to understand about mammals is their ethology, their behavior is what dictates their mating and their breeding. You can't just put a male next to a female and expect results. They have to have the right amount of land for the male to have. He has to be, in some ways, kind of juiced up for it by the threat of other males, as well as the presence of a female in season. And so it's not surprising it hadn't worked in captivity. And we took this, we tranquilized this enormous beast, put him on an aeroplane and flew him to Kenya and then took him on a truck all the way to the conservancy where we popped him down and slowly got him accustomed to his new, or indeed old from his memory, I suppose, environment. He died a year or so ago, sadly. Obviously, his seed has been kept. He didn't successfully mate with any of the females there, so there are only females now. Some form of artificial insemination is possible. But the experience of being close to these animals, and there were babies of black rhinos and white rhinos who were not northern whites, and I suckled them with milk and fed them and petted them. People are afraid of them, and rightly in the wild, they might, if they see you, they've got very bad eyesight, but if they sort of catch a glimpse of you or smell you, they will lower their heads and charge to get you out of there. But they are grazing animals. They are the sweetest, gentlest creatures, and so beautiful.
I long to interview Pete Fernhead of African Parks, who's recently rescued 2,000 rhinos out of the world's largest rhino farm, because the farmer has, I think, gone out of business and they've realised that they're not going to be able to sell this rhino horn, thankfully. And so 2,000 rhinos are now being placed back in different African parks, restoration projects from Malawi to Mozambique, which I think is quite extraordinary.
Yeah. One of the sad things is that you have to saw off the horns so that they don't attract the poachers. So the rhinos are hornless, but they'll even kill a rhino to dig out the root of the horn that is underneath. That's how valuable the damn stuff is. And yet it's keratin, as you know, its fingernails are the same chemical compound.
And they kill the rhinos without horns also to save themselves the trouble of inadvertently tracking the same one again. I mean, Kevin Peterson, the former England cricketer, is doing a brilliant job on combating poaching of rhinos. But back to England, what do you think General Melchett would say about all these bloody beavers and wolves and other things that we're talking about?
He would definitely be loud there. So, beavers, yes. That reminds me. I must go to Lock & Company in St. James's and get myself a new hat. because I suspect he had no trouble in wearing beaver hats. Beaver fur was used for hats a lot, wasn't it? And for various other things. Yes, I don't think he would be likely to be a conservationist.
He loved his pigeon, though. Was it Speckled Bob?
Very true. He could be fond of animals. Yes, Speckled Jim. I remember someone it wasn't that long ago shouting at me across the street, "You bastard pigging murderer," I thought they shouted at me. And I didn't know what they were talking about. I thought, was it because I was wearing leather shoes, which actually I wasn't, so it couldn't be that. I sort of rounded the corner with quickened step, and then I heard someone hurrying after me, going, "Mr. Fry, Mr. Fry." And I thought, oh my God, it's this person who calls me a bastard pigging murderer. And I thought, oh, there's still some people around, so I'll risk it. So I turned around and said, "Yes." And he said, "I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." I said, "Well, you called me a bastard pigging murderer?" He said, "No, I was quoting a Blackadder line. You blasted pigeon murderer." Oh, that's right. In the court case, I accused Blackadder of being a pigeon murderer. And he was just quoting the line back to me. But yes, I did like Speckled Jim, my beloved Speckled Jim. The very thought of him makes me cry. I think of him every time I go along Park Lane, where they have that memorial to the animals that gave their lives in the service of their country in the First War, probably not knowing that that's what they were doing. But
yeah, I'm rather moved by that statue as well. I like it. I think it's part of London's eccentricity. I love it. Stephen, I'm so grateful to you for taking the time to chat to me on this podcast. I want to get these rewilding stories out to as many people as possible. Yeah. I mean, I've interviewed recently a guy called Alejandro Espinoza in Monterrey, Mexico, who works for the world's largest cement company, Cemex. And I discovered through a completely random publication called Global Cement, which I happened to be looking at because I was Googling bison reintroduction.
You sure you weren't doing Have I Got News for You?
No, I wasn't. And I was looking for stories about bison reintroduction and found that Cemex are rewilding several 100,000 acres at a place called El Carmen on the Mexican-US border, where they've removed thousands of kilometers of fencing and restored this extraordinary mosaic of wetlands and savanna and forest. And they now have the first wild free-roaming herd of bison for nearly 200 years in Mexico, alongside pronghorn antelope and bighorn sheep and cougars and jaguars and all these things coming back. Wow. And no one knows about these extraordinary projects happening all over the world. So I thought I'll set up a podcast series and I'll bring it to the attention of as many people as possible that there are some really exciting things happening in a whole range of different places. So I'm really grateful for you coming onto this.
You're doing an amazing job, and your passion and your knowledge and your enthusiasm is clear for all to hear. And I will only end on saying, don't you know the difference between a buffalo and a bison? You can't wash your hands in a buffalo.
I was about to give a serious
very
answer.
Taxonomical answer.
Well, I've got a Mexican one for you. How do you titillate an ocelot? By oscillating its tits a lot. I'm feeling a little bit starstruck, having spent the last 3/4 of an hour chatting with Stephen Fry, one of my heroes, who's someone I've spent almost my whole life watching on TV and listening to and laughing to. And it's just so important that people like Stephen Fry, who are enormously popular, who have big platforms, do raise the profile of nature and rewilding in the way that he has in so many different ways. It's just very, very important to the whole movement. I'm really grateful to Stephen, and if you enjoyed listening to that conversation as much as I enjoyed making it, please do give us a like on whatever platform you use, maybe a review, share the podcast around. We're really growing fast now. Lots of people all over the world are listening to these podcasts, and I really want it to get big. I want lots of people to hear these stories, so I'm truly grateful to you. Next time I'm going to be talking to a truly fascinating guy from America named Brett Jenks. Brett runs an organisation called RARE. What RARE does is harness the innate pride that people have in their own wildlife and the nature around where they live, the love that they feel for their natural surroundings and the unique wildlife that they've known all their lives, in order to build societal movements, bottom-up movements for saving nature. The first of RARE's big successes was on the island of St. Lucia, where the island's unique parrot was saved by a whole-of-society effort on the back of work pulled together by RARE. It really works, and these kinds of behavioural and psychic insights seem to be absolutely essential to the cause of restoring nature. I do hope you'll join us.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about a series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species: bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.